So like I said yesterday, this is like the second or third time I've done this very, very basic jQuery. And just like very, very basic SQL yesterday, this is very, very basic. I mean, it's for people that just have, that are starting at zero. And so if you have ever written any jQuery, this is probably, you're probably already past the point of where this would be useful. I did a second one called Very Basic jQuery, where I moved on from here. And I've got I've got all the notes from the last time I did Very, Very Basic jQuery, plus I've got some of the notes from when I did Very Basic jQuery. And I'm just going to kind of go for about an hour. And if anybody has any questions, ask, interrupt. Don't be afraid to interrupt. This is more fun to do this kind of workshop in person because there's all the people around you and people feel more able to interrupt and ask questions. But don't be afraid to interrupt. Don't be afraid to ask questions. So you should all see a web page that says Very, Very Basic jQuery for Koha. Is that what you're seeing? Jason's nodding his head. And that's where you can find that presentation. The link is in the chat box there. So the first question I always answer when I do this is, what does jQuery have to do with Koha? So Koha has 4 system preferences that allow users to add JavaScript and jQuery to the OPAC or the staff client or the self-checkout system and the self-check-in system. And so these system preferences allow you to inject code into Koha that Koha will run that will change the way that the staff client or the OPAC or the self-check system, it changes the way that they look and the way that they operate, so that Janice mentioned Ex Libris, and that was, I was at an Ex Libris library when we migrated to Koha. And the way that things generally worked with Ex Libris is that you could, I remember one feature in particular where we asked them, would it be possible for staff to be able to change the pickup location of a library, of a request after the request has been made? That was all we wanted. We just, people would place requests, they'd pick the wrong location, and there was no way in Voyager, and this was like in 2006 or 2007, there was no way after the request had been placed to change the pickup location. You would have to go in and cancel the request and then replace the request with the new location. And so that was what we asked for, a simple thing. Can you change it so that we can change the pickup location after a request has been made? That, I think we asked for that in 2006. Like in about 2010, 4 years later, they said, hey, we added that feature you really wanted. And they added it in the next version and it had bugs in it, and you would try to change a pickup location and the whole system would crash and you'd have to restart the client, which was not a web-based client. You would have to restart the Windows program or the Mac program that you were using. And it took them about a year to fix it to where you could change the location and it wouldn't completely crash the whole system. You wouldn't have to start over again. So they actually made it worse. And when you, in situations like that, you kind of feel helpless as an employee where, you just want this really simple thing and the developers of the product aren't listening to you. And it's something that, doesn't sound that complicated. Well, the advantage using JavaScript or jQuery in Koha makes it so that you can do minor changes without having to go through the whole development process. You can make modifications to the way things look on the screen and sometimes to the workflows and sometimes the way the system acts without having to find a developer, to write some code and go through the whole process of getting the code into the system and making it work right. You can just do it yourself sometimes in just a few minutes if you know these the way to write some basic jQuery. So the most basic answer to this question is you can use jQuery to modify the way Koha looks and operates without having to do a development. So that's why it's worth knowing. The next question that I usually get when I'm talking about jQuery is, what is jQuery? This is like yesterday's question, what is SQL? So jQuery is a JavaScript library. That begs the question, what is a JavaScript library? And it's a set of predefined functions that you can easily do without having to know all of JavaScript. An analogy that I think I've used that I might not have written into here is like JavaScript is like the full recipe for how to make a cake, and jQuery, you know, is the customer expectation where you say, I just want to make a cake. And so jQuery is saying, I want to make a cake, and JavaScript is the full recipe for how to make a cake. So here on this, in the web page, there's an example. This is the JavaScript for how to hide a selector, how to hide something in HTML. You have to get the element by the ID, you have to know the selector, and then you change .style .display equals none. The same command in jQuery is you put in the selector .hide. So it's a much simplified version of some JavaScript. So all of this stuff is replaced by selector, and all of this stuff is replaced by this. So it's really kind of a shorthand. And that's what I have as the most basic answer, is jQuery is a simplified JavaScript that pretty much anybody can learn. And I do have some links here on this page. If we go to jquery.com, this is the full manual for jQuery. All the commands, the full documentation is here. So anything you want to know about writing jQuery, this is the official jQuery site, and all of the commands and the full documentation is there. And that's great, you know, if you've been doing it for a while and you want to look up, you want to try and remember how to use a specific function. There's also, like I mentioned yesterday with SQL, there is a W3 website. And W3 is the place where you go and they'll want you to go through their whole tutorial, take their class, and then send them like $100, and then they'll send you a certificate that says, yay, you're certified by W3 schools in jQuery. But you can do all of this stuff without paying any money. You can access their full site. It's only if you want the certificate, which is kind of irrelevant to that you need to pay. So these are both good sites, and our library subscribes to LinkedIn Learning, which used to be lynda.com. I found a LinkedIn Learning course for jQuery. There is a LinkedIn Learning course, and so it gives you, you know, if you want a formal course in how to do this with somebody explaining everything to you, and your library or a library in your area that you have access to uses lynda.com or LinkedIn Learning. There's this one, and there's a couple of others. This one was jQuery Essential, and it looked like the simplest one that I found on their site. So I didn't really cover, I mentioned it up here, but I kind of skipped over it. There are 4 system preferences that really govern where you can use jQuery and what you can do with it. And the easiest way to find all of these system preferences is just go to the Koha admin and search system preferences for JS. And there is the JavaScript for the self-checking user, and I'm on the koha-US demo site. We've got self-checking user JS, self-checkout user.js, which we don't have anything configured on the demo. You do get a enhanced content. That one's not the koha.js. But we have the opaque user.js, and we have the intranet user.js. This one adds JavaScript, adds jQuery to your opaque, and this one adds jQuery to your intranet. There is a fifth one called intranet slip printer JS that I don't know of anybody that's using this, because it also requires that you use it in conjunction with a Firefox plugin. And this plugin hasn't been updated since 2016. And even as far back as when we started using Koha, when I started using Koha, I could never get this to work the way that it said it was supposed to. So I've never really used it. And I think there might be some bugs about getting rid of it on Bugzilla. So jQuery has some basic components. All of the statements start with a $sign and end with a semicolon. Selectors are inside of quotes, inside of parentheses, and events or actions start with a dot and have something in parentheses. And when you put it all together, you get a $sign, left parenthesis, quote, quote, right parenthesis, dot, parenthesis, parenthesis, semicolon. And so all you're really doing with jQuery is filling in these blanks. You just need to find something to put inside the quotes and something to put in front of that second set of parentheses. So I'll slow down for a second and see if anybody has any questions so far. I see a lot of people kind of rocking their heads, and a lot of people with their cameras off. So what is a selector? A selector is something from HTML. So it helps a lot if you know some HTML. And I think Christopher mentioned that too when he was talking about his presentation on Tuesday about facets. It's really helpful to, when you're doing things with Koha, since it is all web-based, it's not a bad idea to know some basic HTML, because the things that you're going to be doing with Koha, you're going to be modifying what's on the screen, and what's on the screen is all HTML. Oh, so Christopher says, I thought you were sleeping during my presentation. No, I was awake for most of that. So what is a selector? Let me hop over here to Koha. And one of the things that I probably should add to the instructions or the website there is one of your friends, when you're using when you're doing anything with jQuery, one of your friends is going to be the tools in your browser, the inspector. So let's say that I wanted to modify the course reserves button. If you do Control-Shift-I, or there's a couple of other commands that'll open the inspector. One of them is up here under More Tools in Firefox, and the Web Developer Tools. That opens up this inspection tool, and you can see all of the things that are going on underneath this web page to build it. So let's say we wanted to modify the course reserves button. You can open the inspector, click on this arrow button over here, and then click on course reserves, and then it'll highlight it down here, and we can see that this, it's an anchor, and it's got a class of icon general, icon course reserves, and then there's the actual href actual link to where that'll take you in Koha. So these things over here, if we've got classes, and then we can use those to select that element, and then we can, once we've selected it, then we can do something with it. So the inspector is your friend, and it can help you. A selector tells jQuery which part of the page you're going to modify, essentially. That's the context in Koha and jQuery. And then after the selector, we've got an event or an effect or a method. And that's where once you've selected something, the event, effect, or method is what's telling jQuery, now that you've selected this thing, here's what we're going to do with it. And so here's a question from Tasha, maybe a question for later on in the presentation. Is it possible to debug non-working jQuery in Firefox? I haven't managed to figure that out. That's probably not a good question for this presentation, but we can talk about that later in the working sessions. Christopher might be a good person to jump in on that and help out with that too. And I did mention the selector. I have done this presentation a couple of times, but I haven't done it in a while. And I looked over it pretty quickly last night because I was so happy that today was the last day of the conference. I've really enjoyed this conference, but man, it's exhausting. So I did mention the how to find the selectors. Control-Shift-I is the way I always open the developer tools. And there is a library in the Koha community of things that people have already written. And it is quite a set of different things that people have done. So there are 164 jQuery bits and pieces that people have written for the staff client. And for the OPAC, there are 88. And then there's some other miscellaneous ones for search-related, enhanced content in the OPAC, enhanced content for the staff. There's a lot of stuff going on here. So if you ever want to learn how to hide the auto-renew option, there's somebody who's already written that. So the jQuery library is really useful. And one of the things you need to know about the staff client, the intranet user JS system preference, is it requires this command in it. Document ready function, and then you've got a pair of curly brackets here, and all of the jQuery you write goes in the middle of these curly brackets. So if we head back over to the Koha demo site, let me show you that. So if we go to intranet user JS, we've got the first half of this document ready function up here. And then way at the bottom, we've got the closing brackets for that. So everything in here is what fits in this little tiny space that I've got in on this page. And in my system, I have a comment right after this spot. You can put comments into jQuery by doing // I have a note in mind reminding me to never delete the comment that's above this line, and a similar one at the bottom, because if you accidentally break this, the jQuery isn't going to work right in the staff client. In OPAC user JS, you can still put that there even if you don't need it. I found that in OPAC user JS, it's no longer needed. And actually in the staff client, there are a couple of places where it seems to be needed, where jQuery seems to work without that. And then there are a couple of places where it doesn't work without that. So I tend to always leave it in. And there are two schools of thought on this command. One school of thought is that every piece of jQuery should be wrapped inside this function. And then the other school of thought is you just put it at the beginning, this at the beginning, and this at the end, and everything else can go in the middle, in between there. The schools of thought that I've heard are that if you wrap every single individual piece of jQuery in that document ready function, that it's slower, that it takes longer for the jQuery to load. And the school of thought that I've heard about the document ready function, then putting everything in one document ready function. The reason some people don't like to do that is because one bad command anywhere in that whole list sheet of jQuery is going to break the whole thing. But if you have each piece wrapped individually, then if you have one that doesn't work, the others will continue to work. So both methods work, but I prefer the first method. So let's actually, let me see if anybody has any questions before I move on. And so Christopher's mentioning F12 will open the tools. The console tab and the inspector can be helpful finding errors. Yeah, using the console can help you find errors. I think that's probably in response to Tasha's question. And oh, Fred's leaving, so see you later, Fred. I think Christopher is connecting to some other. Yeah, you can write jQuery to be limited to just one page in the system, and then that way you can just test it on one page before you release it to the before you break everything. You can break just one page before you break everything. So let's actually get some stuff in jQuery and do some things. So the My Account dropdown. Let me go over to the demo site again. Let me kill the wiki page. So at some libraries, the staff accounts, we don't let the people that are logged in check things out with their staff accounts. And so we don't see the reason to have this My Account thing here. So let's just, let me show you a simple way to get rid of that as an example of what we can do with some jQuery. So I'm just going to put a comment there so I know that these can be deleted after we're done here. So what we've got here is a selector that says top links. And I can find that out by going to this page, opening up the console. I'm going to drop that down. And when I look at that, it says the class is top links. And I'm going to say top links dash my account must be the class for that specific. Yeah, top links my account. So this element over here is a list item. It's part of this drop-down list. And it's got a class, top links my account. So that's the selector we want to use, top links my account. And then we're going to say just hide that. And so if I put that in here and save it and reload, when I come back up here, the My Account is gone. So if there's anything you want to hide on a page, this is just an example more than anything, but hiding things on a page is really simple. We can do the same thing with the checkouts. In that dropdown, I'm going to reload the page. And so now we've just got set libraries, search history, and logout. And if we look in the actual code, we can see that top links my checkouts is still there, but that .hide parentheses command, what it's doing is that .hide parentheses is the shortened version of telling jQuery to add some CSS to that element. So the list item with that class, it's going to add style equals display none, which is some basic CSS. So the element is still there. We haven't removed it from the page. And if I delete that from the, if I delete the display none from the inspector, it comes back. So hide isn't removing it from the page, it's just making it invisible on the page. Jason says, I have a bajillion document ready functions, so don't judge me. I won't judge you on that. But for TJ says, what if the HTML does not have a class, or if it's used by multiple elements? Is it better to use JS or CSS? It kind of depends on what you're doing. So if the element doesn't have a class, you can use any selectors. You can use IDs. You can, if you're using the inspector, and let's say we wanted to go to list here, I'm going to choose this element. Down in the inspector, you can hover over the element and right-click it and say copy the CSS selector. And then you can actually, I'll paste that in the chat box. It's just telling me that the class on this page, that's the selector that it says to use for this. A way that you can narrow in is, we know that this element is underneath another element called biglinks.list. So this list has a class of biglinks.list. So what we can do, if we want to make sure that we're just hiding that one, is we can so it was biglinks.list, and then so here we're specifying, you know, we're looking for that element for anything with the class of biglinks-list, and then anything in that anything that selects that has the further class of icon general.icon lists. And we can even go further, and it's often not a bad idea to go further. This whole page has a body ID tag, so we can throw in the body ID of main, intranet main, so you can keep you can add all of the parent elements. You can find a way to select them And that's a way of narrowing it down so that you can get down to the exact one you want. That can actually be very helpful because there are a couple of places where it is hard to find a unique selector for an item if the items don't have IDs, if they only have classes. Usually you can find some way that some parent element of that has a good you can find a way to get the string of things there so that you are unique just with the class. IDs are much better because an ID should only be on a page one time. So that full stretch of IDs was this. And Daniel says, George, do you do a basic CSS for Koha? I've never done a basic CSS. I think Andy Bose's presentation was really good. We should talk him into doing one of those because his presentation was really awesome. So where was TJ's question?
I guess the other part was, if there is no ID or class, is there a way to get to an element that is sort of naked?
Yeah, usually it involves finding the class for something above it and then figuring out which, like if it's a list, you figure out it's like the fifth element in this list, and then if the list itself has a class or an ID, then you can say find this the list with this ID, and then find the fifth LI in that string, and then select that one. The hardest ones to find are the pieces of text that aren't wrapped inside of anything. They're not inside of an anchor. They're not inside of a. Sometimes I've come across them where they're not even inside of a paragraph. Those are hard to find, and generally there's a really complicated way of identifying them and then wrapping a span or a paragraph tag around them. And then, so you use jQuery to add an element you can select to those things. And that's probably a little bit beyond what I'm saying we are doing here as very, very basic jQuery. So, so that was selecting by class. I think I'll skip over this last one so we can move on a little bit further. So this here was selecting by class. Another way is selecting by ID. Classes all start with a dot. So if we find a thing in like these buttons, they all have a class. So the HTML will say class equals, and then it will have a list of what the classes are. To select by class, you take the class out of here and put a dot in front of it. And so all of these things, top links, my checkouts. And actually, let's go back to the set library, because I think that might be why that's in there. Somewhere or another, I got thrown off. So let's get back in here, set library. So the set library has a link, or it has a class, but the class is just top links. And so I think there are some other things that have the class top links, and that's why in this example, this is another way you can select things. This one, I'm selecting everything with the class of top links, but then I'm using contains to say where the top links class element contains the text's select library. So that might be another way to select them too, TJ. If you have if you have some kind of selector to grab on, you can say, give me the selector where it contains specific text. And so if we add that in there and save it, which I did save, then this will delete or remove that set library dropdown from the set library from that dropdown. Selecting by ID, many of the things in here, well, a class is kind of a CSS thing where we're saying all of the things with this class, CSS is going to style them a specific way. And so multiple things will have a class. An ID is usually unique. If an ID isn't unique, that creates a problem because IDs should be unique. There are a couple of places that I found in Koha where the IDs aren't unique. And there were more of those like 5 years ago, 6 years ago, but I think most of those places where an ID had been duplicated, I think most of those have been fixed. And I'm not sure that I know of any duplicate IDs in Koha anymore. It doesn't mean I'm not wrong. It just means that I can't think of any off the top of my head now. So if we find something on a page with an ID where like this logged in menu, this whole thing over here, that whole anchor has an ID of logged in menu. So if we wanted to select, if you want to select something by ID, the ID starts with a £. And so this particular sample here, if we go to the search page, the subtypes. So this whole set of subtypes here, I know several libraries where these aren't really being used. And so this whole element, this whole box here has an ID of subtype. And so in this piece, we're saying find the subtype tag, find that element that has the ID of subtype and hide it. And so if we reload this, it's going to hide that entire box. And again, hide is just hiding. It's still there. And the code is still there. It's just not visible anymore. One of the things we do at our library is on the main login page. So let me go back here and actually log out. Our libraries, we don't let the staff members switch the library when they're logging in. So they're logged into the library where their account is set up. We can add this bit of code here. And if we log back out, that gets rid of the dropdown. And so that's being selected by ID. The issue with that is that it made the dropdown disappear, but it didn't make the entire element disappear. And that's because, let me go back to there. This, that element is inside of a paragraph. And above the dropdown, which has an ID of branch, that's inside of this paragraph. And the label that says library is just floating there with the label doesn't have an ID. But what we can do is we know we want to get rid of both of those things. So what we can do here is we can say find that branch, and we're going to add a command before the hide that's called parent. And so what that's saying is find on main auth, find something with where the ID is main auth. And then when we look beneath that, we're going to look for the ID of main branch. And once we find branch, we're going to select the parent. And so I log back in. So let's get rid of that and add that in there with the parent command. And then when we log back out again, so now that label is gone, because instead of just making the, well, I'm not going to be able to find it. There we go. Instead of just making the thing with the ID of branch disappear, we said find that branch and then look for the thing that it's inside of and make that whole thing disappear. So that's another way of selecting things that you are harder to find an element for. So let's see. Jason says, I always try to fix things with CSS before resorting to JS. Someone somewhere told me that it's lighter, less burdensome, has less impact on load times. And that's correct. Sometimes I'm just using this primarily as an example of one thing that can be done with jQuery because it's simple to do in jQuery. If this was like advanced jQuery for Koha, then I would say just throw the whole lot in the CSS. Seems to me, Elaine says, seems to me CSS is potentially more general. JS can be very particular. The CSS can be particular too. They both use selectors, and you can stack the selectors the same way that I did there for the for main intranet, big links, icon general, icon list. I think Ed's going to say something. Oh, I thought you're logged in your own laptop, Ed. No, I thought you were walking up to the computer at the front of the room. Jason says CSS is sort of cosmetic. CSS is sort of cosmetic. JS can have logic. If you want to make text red, you use CSS. If you want to make it red, if there's a certain word in it, then there's JavaScript, yes. And Wally says, I love this. We only have one library, and that extraneous thing bugs me. So the specific, for Wally, I'll put that in the chat there. That's exactly what you need to make that thing disappear from the login screen. So right now, all I've talked about is one command, and that's hide. We can actually do a lot more with jQuery. This is actually one of the first pieces of jQuery that I ever learned, and I learned it from Ed, who just turned his computer on a few seconds ago. Ed was worked for Bywater when I did my very first training on Koha. And so this is a piece of jQuery that works on the add a patron screen. So if we go to patrons, actually let me disable it for a second. So this is my experience with staff at the library. We were doing our very first training in Koha, which was Ed's very first training for Bywater. And the label in Koha for the last name is surname. And we're at the training, and one of the people that worked at one of the libraries said, what's a surname? And so, my immediate thought was, if this is a person, we've got 25 people in the room here that that are, learning about Koha. They see the word, one of them sees the word surname and asks, what's a surname? And my used to manage a restaurant brain says, if one person is complaining about something, there are 10 other people that have the exact same complaint. They just don't have the courage to say, I have a complaint here. So my thought was, if she doesn't know what a surname is, there are probably 10 other people that are going to ask the same questions. So Ed helped me write this, and he said, we're going to look for a label, and the label is going to equal for surname, and we're going to use the HTML command, and we're going to change that from surname to last name. We're going to insert this HTML into that label. And so nothing to save. This is the result where surname becomes last name. And then we went on and we did the exact same thing for the first name. In our old system, we had a separate place to put a first name and a middle name. There was a separate field for that. And that was something that we lost in Koha. So we changed first name to first name plus middle name. And the code for that is exactly the same. So this element, both of these elements are labels. And so we're looking for a label. And under the label, one of the attributes of this label is for equals surname. And so label, and then in square brackets, we put for equals surname. And then we're just telling it, make the HTML in the things that match this label equals surname. And this one is saying, make the first name match first name plus line break middle name. And then we went on and we did the exact same thing to nickname. So that this other name here becomes nickname. And the whole reason we did this at that library was just to make it simpler for staff, from staff perspectives. This is why I do a lot of things where I change the way Koha looks and acts, and changing labels and changing descriptions, is so that I won't have to answer the question. I won't have people calling me from 60 miles away saying, what is this surname thing? What does that mean? If I can head those questions off, that just simplifies my life. So this is a way to change text on a field. We can also use it to pre-populate fields. So on the accounts page, here we got username and password. So we can take this, and let me walk through how to find this element. So I go to the inspector and I highlight, well, now my screen's going to freeze for a second, huh? Well, let me look and see if there are any questions. Wally says, during upgrades, are these customizations likely to be broken? I wouldn't say likely, but many of the time, sometimes they are. And one of the things that I do before an upgrade is we have a test server. We are a Bywater customer. And so we do have a test server. And one of the tasks that I do before every upgrade is I go through the jQuery and all of the customizations we have and make sure that they all work. And so that's one of the reasons I'm being pretty fast and loose with this here today, because it's just a demo. But you can put comments into the jQuery system preferences. jQuery comments are just 2 slashes, or you can do comments like this where it's / asterisk and then asterisk slash, and then any comments you want to go in between those two asterisks. And generally what I do, like I know that this is on the, one of the ways that I make it simple to know exactly which page I'm doing, that this jQuery is going to affect, is I put the breadcrumbs from the page into the comments. So that way, and this is another thing that I dealt with when I took this job, is there was a whole ton of jQuery already in our system, and only like 4 lines of it had been commented. So the first time I did an upgrade here, there were all these crazy bits of code in the jQuery system preferences, and I had no idea what they were doing. So now if you look at our jQuery, it's pretty well commented so that it's easy to find which page is being affected by which piece of jQuery or JavaScript. Christopher says it's a good idea to review because sometimes the changes you make with jQuery are actually features in the newer version. One example of that was Christopher actually wrote some jQuery so that when you put text up in this box here and then switched from one to the other, it used to be that text would disappear. If you put something in search patrons and then flip to checkout, you would lose whatever you had typed up here. And Christopher wrote some jQuery that fixed that. And then like a version later, somebody had added that feature, had taken Christopher's jQuery and added it into Koha. And Jason says, if I fix something with jQuery and then find a related bug, or file a related bug, he puts the bug number in the jQuery comments that he knows to remove it when the bug's been fixed. That's a good idea. I don't do that, so maybe I should start. So the password, if we want to look at that, I don't know why my screen keeps freezing here. So this input has we have 2 password fields, and one of them has an input ID of password, the other one has an input ID of password too. But we can take some jQuery, and this is just when the jQuery finds an element with the ID of entry form, which is one of the elements on this page. So the form itself is called entry form. And the password ID is password. And so this piece of jQuery here is going to tell Koha that when we see the entry form password, we're going to give it a value of 1234. And so if we load that, then we can't see what it says under there, but I'm sure it's 1234. So the problem there is that we need to set 2 different fields to 1234 if we want them to match. So we can add a second one. This one is entry form, password 2, value 1234. And this will give us both of these back as 1234. That's kind of clunky to have 2 separate lines. So what we can do instead is we can put both of these together. And so we can say, we can separate them with a comma. So we're saying when we find these selectors and these selectors in this order, we can put that value in both of those at once as 1234. And that just makes the code shorter. And so if I reload this, then both of these should have a value of 1234. And like I said, you know, I've talked about hide. I didn't talk about remove. I kind of skipped over that, I guess. But I've talked about hide, I've talked about HTML and value. Those are all things that if we do, if we go back to the W3 tutorials site and go down and find jQuery, a list of all of those, oh, they've changed around the sidebar a little bit. References, selectors, events, effects. There we go, HTML, CSS. You know, these are the references down here for jQuery. These are the ways that you can do all of these. It shows you how to use different kinds of selectors. The selectors that I've been doing so far are pretty simple, but we could do, you can do selectors where the attribute starts with, where it matches exactly, where it ends with, where it begins with. So there's a whole list of things you could do here to make it easier to shorten the code. Because theoretically, I could say entry form where ID equals, where the ID begins with password, and then we could make this even shorter. So with this piece of basic jQuery, we can set the value of everybody's password to 1, 2, 3, 4 when that page loads. That's not particularly useful, but what we can do is to go beyond that basic step, and we can use we can create a function, and we can say every time we see, this is at the library that I used to work at, every time there was the patron's password was their last name. And so this is taking a value from the patron's surname. So what we got here is a function that's saying every time we find the patron's surname, we're going to blur that, which is a way of saying we're going to remove focus from that. And we're going to do this function where we take the password, the 2 password fields, and the value that we're going to put in there is the value from the surname. And this is the most advanced thing that I think I'm going to show you today. But the way that this will work then, I'm going to reload this page. So we've got no value up here in surname yet. And we've got no value down here in password. What'll happen is when we're gonna put a name in the last name field, and when we blur this field, when we take the focus away from it, if we go back down here to password now, when we took focus out of that box, it took the value from that input field and it put it down here into password and confirmed password. So this is the way that jQuery can help you with your workflows. It can, you can change the way elements look on the screen. You can do basics with workflows. And this is just some of the very, very basic stuff that you can do. Christopher's talk yesterday or the day before about the facets was, done mostly with jQuery. The driver's license code that he worked on was done, I think, entirely with jQuery. So there's a lot you can do to make some changes. You just need to learn a little bit about how to use it. And like I said, there's the great resources, the Koha jQuery library, where there's already a lot of stuff already written. In the Koha Education Committee, a lot of the videos that Christopher and I have done every other Thursday have been about using jQuery to make changes to the way Koha looks and works for people.